The moment Winifred Hawkins heard the words come out of the old woman's mouth, she felt the ground shift beneath her boots like the earth itself had decided to betray her. "You are not who you think you are, girl." Those 9 words, spoken by Martha Shepard in the amber light of the ranch kitchen, cracked through Winifred's chest like a rifle shot. The cast iron skillet she had been holding clattered against the stone floor, sending a sharp ring through the silence that had swallowed the room whole. Every person gathered at that long oak table went completely still. Chester Shepard, seated at the head, was already rising from his chair. His jaw was set tight, his dark eyes fixed on his mother with an expression that could only be described as barely contained dread. The 2 younger boys, 14-year-old Colt and 16-year-old Eli, looked from their grandmother to the woman they had come to love over these past months with wide, terrified eyes. Winifred's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and forced herself to breathe. "What did you say to me?" Her voice came out steady, which surprised her, because nothing inside her was steady at that moment. Nothing inside her had been steady since the day she had walked up that long dirt road with a cracked leather satchel, and a heart full of secrets she had not yet dared to name. Martha set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. She was a formidable woman, lean and weathered, with silver hair pinned back and eyes that had seen too much of this world to be impressed by any of it. She looked at Winifred with something that was not cruelty, but was not quite kindness either. It was something raw and terrified and desperate. "I said you are not who you think you are," Martha repeated, her voice lower this time. "And before this goes any further between you and my son, you deserve to know the truth, even if the truth breaks every last thing we have built here." Chester's chair scraped back hard. "Mama, stop." But Martha was already reaching into the pocket of her apron, and what she pulled out was a photograph. Old, worn at the corners, the image faded to sepia and shadow. She slid it across the table toward Winifred. Winifred's breath left her body completely. Because the woman in that photograph, the young woman with the strong jaw and the dark eyes and the particular way her hands were folded in her lap, looked exactly like Winifred Hawkins. And she had never seen that photograph in her life. It had started 5 months earlier, on a morning in early April of 1878, in the small and suffocating town of Borden Creek, Texas. Winifred had $23, a satchel with a broken buckle, and a newspaper clipping folded into a tight square and tucked inside the lining of her boot. She had been carrying that clipping for 3 weeks, ever since she had torn it from the Borden Creek Gazette while the sheriff's deputy had been distracted by a horse kicking up a fuss outside his office window. The advertisement was simple and direct. Help wanted. Shepard Ranch, Mesa Hollow, Texas. Seeking experienced hand for domestic work, cooking, mending, and general assistance. WAGES paid monthly. Inquire in person. She had not known much about Shepard Ranch. She had not known much about Mesa Hollow. What she had known was that she needed to disappear from Borden Creek before the man who had been watching her house at night found a reason to do more than watch. Winifred was 26 years old, and she had been alone in the world for 4 of those years, since the fever had taken her mother, and the gambling debts had taken the house 2 weeks after the funeral. She had worked as a seamstress, a laundress, a cook's assistant, a school teacher for 1 year in a town so small it barely had a name. She was capable, and she was smart, and she was deeply, quietly exhausted in a way she could not explain to anyone who had not lived it. The man who had been watching her house was named Denton Prout, and he was not a man given to patience. He was a cattle broker with connections to the county sheriff, a dark past that everyone in Borden Creek knew about and no one mentioned out loud, and a possessive interest in Winifred that she had never invited and could not seem to shake. He had asked her twice to be his wife. She had declined twice. The third time, he had not asked so much as declared, and when she had told him no again, he had smiled the kind of smile that made her understand exactly what kind of forced choice she was dealing with. So she had packed her satchel in the dark, left her rented room before sunrise, and walked to the stage line. Mesa Hollow was 4 hours by coach and another hour by wagon from the nearest town. The land was flat and wide and impossibly vast, broken up by low hills and ancient mesquite trees, and the occasional hawk drawing slow circles overhead. Winifred had pressed her face to the coach window and watched the world expand around her and felt, for the first time in months, like she could breathe. The ranch itself came into view just as the afternoon light was turning gold. It was larger than she had expected. A main house of whitewashed timber, solid and square, with a deep porch running the full length of the front. A barn painted red, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, a chicken coop, several corrals with horses that moved with the particular easy grace of well-tended animals. Beyond the corrals, cattle dotted the hills as far as she could see. Winifred had smoothed her hair, straightened her collar, and walked up the drive with her chin lifted because she had learned long ago that the way you held yourself in the first 10 seconds of anything determined more about how people would treat you than any words you could speak. A man had come out of the barn at the sound of her boots on the packed earth. Chester Shepard was not what she had expected, though she could not have said exactly what she had expected. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark brown hair that needed a cut and 2 or 3 days of stubble on a jaw that looked like it had been carved with purpose. He was wearing canvas work pants, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and boots so worn they had clearly been to the far edge of this land and back again more times than could be counted. He looked to be perhaps 30, maybe 32. He had a smear of grease on his right forearm, and he was wiping his hands on a cloth as he walked toward her, and his expression was careful and assessing in a way that was not unfriendly, exactly, but was not warm either. Not yet. "Can I help you?" he asked. "I hope so," Winifred said. "I am here about the position. The advertisement in the Gazette said to inquire in person." He looked at her for a moment that stretched just a half-second longer than was strictly polite. "You came all the way out here for a housekeeping job." "I came all the way out here for honest work," she said evenly. "If that is the same thing, then yes." Something shifted in his expression, just slightly, a fractional relaxation around the eyes. "Chester Shepard," he said, and extended his hand. "Winifred Hawkins," she said, and shook it. His grip was firm without being forceful. She noted that about him right away, because she had learned to note things like that. The way a man shook a woman's hand told you almost everything you needed to know about whether he thought you were a person or a thing. He asked her to come inside, and she followed him up the porch steps and through the front door into the main room of the house, which was large and plainly furnished, and had the particular atmosphere of a home that had once been warmer and was now running slightly cold, not from neglect, but from loss. She could not have explained how she knew that. She just did. Martha Shepard had appeared from the kitchen with a cup of coffee before Winifred had even sat down, which she later realized was Martha's way of making an assessment of her own. The old woman had set the coffee in front of Winifred and then settled herself in the chair across the table with the directness of someone who had long ago stopped pretending to be less formidable than she was. "Where are you from?" Martha asked. "Borden Creek, most recently." "Most recently," Martha repeated. "Where before that, Calden County, before that San Marcos. You moved around a lot." "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" Winifred had looked at the older woman steadily. "I go where the work is." Martha had studied her for a long moment, and Winifred had held that gaze without flinching, because she was telling the truth. Or at least she was telling the part of the truth that she had decided to tell, which was enough truth to stand on. "Can you cook?" Chester asked. He was leaning against the doorframe between the kitchen and the main room, arms crossed, watching. "I can cook well enough that people ask me to cook again," Winifred said. "I can mend, I can clean, I can manage a household, I can keep accounts if you need that, and I am not afraid of hard work or early mornings." "What about children?" Martha asked. "I like children." Winifred paused. "Do you have children on the property?" Chester shifted. Something moved behind his eyes, brief and complicated. "2 boys. Eli is 16 and Colt is 14. They are my nephews. My brother passed 2 years ago and his wife shortly after. I am raising them." The words were delivered with a flatness that was not coldness, but was the particular kind of control a person maintains when the thing they are talking about is still raw underneath all the scar tissue. Winifred recognized it the way you recognize your own reflection. "I am sorry for your loss," she said, and meant it completely. He looked at her when she said it, and she got the sense that most people who expressed condolences to Chester Shepard did so in a way he could not quite accept, but something in how she said it made him receive it differently. He nodded once, slow, and the line of his jaw released just slightly. She was hired by the end of that first hour. The room she was given was small and clean, at the back of the house near the kitchen. It had a single window that looked out over the herb garden Martha kept, and a narrow iron-frame bed, and a chest of drawers with a small oval mirror mounted above it. It was the most private space Winifred had occupied in 4 years, and the night she first slept in it, she lay awake for a long time simply listening to the silence, which was not quite silence at all but was the sound of wind and cattle and the distant call of a whippoorwill, and she thought that maybe, just maybe, she had found something real. The first weeks passed in the rhythm of hard work and careful watching. Winifred learned the household and the household learned her. She rose before sunrise every morning, stoked the kitchen stove, had coffee ready before anyone else appeared, and spent the days cooking and cleaning and mending, and helping Martha with the preserving and the garden. She was efficient and organized, and she had a particular gift for anticipating what a household needed before anyone thought to ask for it. Eli and Colt were initially suspicious of her in the way that teenagers who have experienced significant loss become suspicious of new attachments, which is to say they were not hostile exactly, but they were watchful and non-committal and prone to testing. Colt, the younger one, tested loudest. He appeared in the kitchen one morning 3 days after her arrival and announced that he hated biscuits and would she please not make them. Winifred had looked at him calmly and said, "That is very helpful information. What do you like for breakfast?" He had blinked, clearly having expected an argument. "Cornbread," he said after a moment. "Cornbread it is," she said, and turned back to her work. The next morning she made cornbread, and Colt ate 3 pieces without saying a word. But when he left the kitchen he paused in the doorway and looked back at her and said, "It is almost as good as my mama's." "That is the finest thing anyone has said to me in a long time," Winifred told him, and she meant that too. After that, Colt began appearing in the kitchen at odd hours to talk about things that had nothing to do with food. He told her about the horses he was training, about a book he was reading, about how he had gotten into a fight at the schoolhouse in town 3 months ago and still was not entirely sure he had been wrong to do it. Winifred listened to all of it with genuine attention, asked questions, offered her thoughts when he wanted them, and did not try to be his mother, which was exactly the right thing to do, because he was not looking for a replacement. He was looking for someone who could hear him. Eli was quieter and more guarded. He was 17 now, she corrected herself, having learned his birthday had fallen 2 weeks before her arrival. He was tall like his uncle, with the same dark eyes, and he carried himself with the particular seriousness of a young man who had been forced to grow up faster than was fair. He did not seek her out the way Colt did, but he was courteous and present, and she noticed that he began staying for breakfast rather than taking his food out to the barn, which Martha told her quietly was a change she had not managed to engineer in 2 years. Chester was the most complicated. He was not unfriendly. He was, in fact, scrupulously fair, paying her wages on the 1st of each month without being reminded, ensuring she had adequate supplies and equipment, and checking in briefly each evening to ask if anything was needed. He said thank you when she cooked and complimented the work without the forced heartiness of someone performing gratitude. He treated her with complete respect. He also treated her with complete distance. Not coldness, exactly. More like a very deliberate maintenance of appropriate space. He did not linger in the kitchen in the mornings. He did not join the conversation she had with the boys at the supper table. When their hands accidentally met passing a dish or a tool, he withdrew his with immediate, almost startled precision. He was a man exercising considerable self-discipline about something, and Winifred, who was exercising considerable self-discipline about several things herself, recognized it clearly, even if neither of them would have named it out loud. What she knew about Chester Shepard, gathered from Martha's occasional comments and the boys' stories, and the thousand small things that accumulate when you live in close quarters with a family, was this. He had run this ranch since he was 22 years old, taking it over from his father who had died of a heart condition. He had worked it alone for years before his brother James came back from a disastrous venture in the silver mines of New Mexico, bringing with him a quiet wife named Clara and 2 small boys. Chester had welcomed all of them without apparent reservation, had made room, had given James a full partnership in the ranch. When James died of pneumonia in the winter of 1876, and Clara followed 3 months later from what the doctor had called a broken heart, but the boys knew had been a fever that she had not had the will to fight, Chester had simply absorbed the grief and continued. He had not married. He had not courted anyone. He had not, to Martha's frequently expressed frustration, done anything about the particular loneliness that lived in him like a guest that had long overstayed its welcome. Winifred might have been able to maintain her own careful distance indefinitely, or at least for longer, if it had not been for the afternoon of the injured calf. It was late May, nearly 6 weeks after her arrival, and a late spring storm had come through fast and violent the night before, the kind of Texas storm that does not announce itself properly. All lightning and horizontal rain and a wind that found every crack in every building. In the morning, they found one of the newborn calves had somehow gotten separated from its mother in the chaos of the night, had gone through a section of fence that the storm had broken, and had been found in a drainage gully with a gash along its right flank and a clear inability to stand. Chester had brought it into the barn and was crouched over it in the clean straw when Winifred appeared with the medical kit. She had simply fetched it from the tack room without being asked, because it was clearly needed, and she handed it to him, and then, because the animal was frightened and struggling, she sat down in the straw on the other side of it and placed her hands gently on its head and spoke to it quietly, the way she had seen her mother speak to frightened things when she was small. Chester looked up at her from across the calf. The barn light was the particular gold of late morning, coming sideways through the wide doors, and the smell was hay and earth and rain that had soaked into old wood. Neither of them spoke for a moment. He began cleaning the wound, and she kept her hands on the animal and kept talking to it softly, and they worked together in a silence that was not awkward but was something else entirely, something that had a texture and a warmth to it that Winifred could feel but did not yet dare to name. The calf settled. Chester sutured the wound with the careful precision of a man who had done this many times and had taught himself to do it well. Winifred watched his hands, which were large and square-fingered, and moved with a steadiness she found unexpectedly moving. When it was done, they both sat back slightly in the straw, and the calf let out a small, indignant sound and attempted to stand, which made them both laugh at the same moment, the same laugh, surprised and genuine and free of all the carefulness they had been carrying. Chester looked at her and she looked at him, and the laugh faded, but something did not fade at all, and they were both very aware of it. "You grew up around animals," he said. It was not a question. "My father kept livestock before things went wrong," she said. "I was good at the calming. My mother said it was a gift." "She was right," he said. A silence. Then, "What happened with your family, if you do not mind saying?" She had told him the shape of it then, sitting in that straw with an injured calf between them. Her father leaving when she was 12, the fog of his reasons that she had never fully understood. Her mother's illness, the debts, the years of managing alone. She had not told him about Denton Prout, not yet. That was still a secret she was keeping close, a dark past she was not ready to set on the table. But she told him enough, and he had listened with the full, unhurried attention of a man who considered it a serious thing when someone chose to tell you something true about themselves. Then he had told her about James. Not the facts, which she already knew, but the feeling of it. The way he had come home from a cattle drive in September of 1876 and found his brother in bed with a fever that should have been manageable and somehow was not. The way the ranch had felt afterward, too large and too quiet and full of the particular weight of continuing. The boys who needed him to be steady, so he was steady. Every day steady. It cost something being that steady. He said that last part almost to himself, as if he had not entirely meant to say it aloud. She said, "I know exactly what you mean." He looked at her directly then, not the careful, assessed gaze of an employer but the open, slightly startled look of a man who has just recognized something. She looked back and did not look away. They did not do anything about it that day. They were both people who had learned to be careful, and careful people do not act on the first moment of recognition, no matter how clear it is. They returned to their separate lanes and their separate work and their separate silences, but the texture of the air between them had changed, and they both knew it, and neither of them tried to pretend otherwise. June arrived and deepened into summer, and the ranch settled into the hot, long rhythms of the season. Winifred had by then become something more than the hired help, though no one had formally acknowledged this transition. She sat at the table for meals rather than eating after. She was included in the planning conversations that happened on Sunday evenings about the week ahead on the ranch. Colt had taken to calling her Miss Winnie with an ease that delighted her, and even Eli had dropped the formal address and simply used her name. Martha watched all of this with an expression that Winifred could not always read. The older woman was not unkind to her. She was, in fact, generous with her knowledge of the household and the land and the history of the ranch, sharing recipes and planting advice and stories with an openness that suggested she had decided, somewhere in those first days, that Winifred was worthy of trust. But there were moments when Martha looked at her with something complicated moving behind her eyes, something that was almost grief, almost recognition, almost a question that wanted desperately to be asked and was being held back by some force Winifred could not identify. She filed those moments away and did not press. She had her own secrets. She could respect someone else's. July brought a drought scare that had everyone tense for 2 weeks, and it also brought the first time Chester called her by her given name without the formal miss preceding it. They had been out at the east fence line together, because one of the ranch hands had quit without notice, and Chester was short-handed, and Winifred had offered to help run the fence check, which he had accepted after a moment of consideration that she had found quietly gratifying. They were working their way along a section near the dry creek bed when he said, "Winifred, hand me that wire stretcher," and the way he said her name, easy and unself-conscious, as if he had been saying it that way for years, landed somewhere in her chest with a warmth that spread outward. She handed him the wire stretcher without commenting on it, but she remembered it. The true turning point came in August. A rider came to the ranch on a Tuesday morning, a stranger on a gray horse with a Borden Creek postmark on the letter he carried. Winifred saw him from the kitchen window and felt the first cold thread of dread work through her stomach before she had even consciously recognized what she was afraid of. By the time she had dried her hands and reached the front porch, Chester had already received the letter and dismissed the rider, and he was standing on the porch steps turning it over in his hands with a slight frown. "It is addressed to the ranch," he said, "but specifically to a Miss W. Hawkins in residence." Her whole body went cold. She took the letter with fingers that she kept absolutely steady and opened it with the careful calm of someone who does not want to show what they are feeling, and she read it, and what was inside was both exactly what she had feared and somehow worse than she had imagined. Denton Pruitt had found her. Not just found her, but had found her and had sent a letter that was courteous in its language and explicit in its threat. He wrote that she had obligations that preceded her current employment. He wrote that he expected her return to Borden Creek within 30 days. He wrote that her current employer might find it of interest to know certain things about the history of Miss Winifred Hawkins, things that might, if made known, complicate her position considerably. She read the letter twice and then folded it precisely and put it in her apron pocket and went back into the kitchen and stood at the window for a long time. Chester came in 10 minutes later. "Winifred." She turned around. He read her face with the focused attention she had come to recognize as characteristic of him, that deep, unhurried reading that took in more than most people managed to see. What was in that letter? She had a choice in that moment. She could lie or deflect or minimize, all of which she had practice with, all of which she was entirely capable of. She had been managing her own troubles alone for 4 years. She was good at it. But there was something about Chester Shepard, about the quality of his attention, and the fundamental decency she had observed in him across 5 months of close living, that made the idea of lying to him feel like a genuine wrongness. Not just tactically unwise, but actually wrong in a way she did not want to be. So she told him the truth. She told him about Denton Prout, about the proposals she had refused, about the watching and the smile that had come after her second refusal, about leaving Borden Creek in the dark with $23 and a satchel. She told him about the deputy who was in Prout's pocket and the sheriff who looked the other way, and the particular trap of being a woman alone in a small town with a powerful man who had decided you were something he was owed. She told him all of it, standing in the kitchen in the summer heat, and she did not cry because she had moved past crying about Denton Prout some time ago, but her voice was tighter than usual, and she was gripping the edge of the counter without quite realizing it. Chester listened without interrupting. When she finished, the silence held for 3 seconds, 4, 5. Then he said, with a quietness that was more forceful than shouting, "He will not come here and threaten you on this land. Chester, he has connections to the law in Borden Creek, and probably—" "I said he will not come here and threaten you on this land," Chester repeated, and the repetition was not impatience but emphasis, a declaration stated twice so she could hear it properly. "You are part of this household. I do not give a man like Denton Prout 1 inch on my property." She looked at him for a long moment. The warmth she had been managing and containing and refusing to name was doing things that were increasingly difficult to manage. "You cannot promise that," she said, not because she was pushing back but because she needed him to understand what she was dealing with. "I can and I am," he said, "and I have a lawyer in San Marcos I use for ranch business. We will send a letter back through him that makes Mr. Prout understand exactly what he is dealing with if he pursues this." The lawyer's letter went out 3 days later. It was calm, precise, and legally thorough, making clear that Winifred Hawkins was an employee of the Shepard Ranch under contract, that any attempt to interfere with her employment or person would be addressed through the appropriate legal channels, and that the ranch had resources and counsel to pursue this matter as far as necessary. Chester had shown it to Winifred before it was sent and asked if she wanted anything added or changed, and she had read it and had to press her lips together hard for a moment before she could speak. "It is exactly right," she said. "Good," he said. And then, because he was Chester and not prone to excess, that was all he said. But he held her gaze a moment longer than was required, and she held his, and between them in that kitchen was everything that neither of them had said yet. Denton Prout's response came 2 weeks later, this time addressed directly to Chester, and it was not threatening. It was carefully worded and subtly menacing in the way of a man who has been made to understand he cannot push as hard as he would like, but who has not entirely relinquished the idea. It referenced, obliquely but deliberately, the fact that he had information about Miss Hawkins that Chester might find significant. He did not specify what this information was. He simply allowed it to sit in the letter like a trap, waiting. Chester had shown it to Winifred and said, "What does he mean by this?" And Winifred had looked at the letter and felt genuinely confused, because she did not know what secret Denton Prout thought he had. Her life had been difficult and her past had been hard, but she had done nothing shameful. She had nothing to hide that she knew of. "I honestly do not know," she said. Chester had studied her face for the lie she was not telling and found none. "All right," he said. "Then we disregard it. A man like that makes threats out of desperation. If he had something real, he would have used it." She had agreed. She had, over the following weeks, largely stopped thinking about it. Which was why, when Martha finally used it, it hit her with the force of something she had no defenses against. And now here she was in that kitchen in October, with the photograph on the table between them and the silence pressing down from the ceiling and Chester on his feet and Winifred's hands shaking at her sides. She picked up the photograph. The woman in it was perhaps 20, seated in what appeared to be a studio in a town of some size. She was wearing a light-colored dress with careful buttons at the collar, and her dark eyes looked out of the image with a directness and composure that Winifred felt in her own face as she looked at it. "Who is this?" she asked, and her voice was barely above a whisper. Martha's jaw was working. She looked for the first time since Winifred had known her, genuinely frightened. Her name was Rosalind Ferris. Before she married, she was Rosalind Crane. The name meant nothing to Winifred. "I have never heard that name." "You would not have. You were 6 months old when she gave you to Margaret Hawkins." The room went absolutely silent. Winifred set the photograph down very carefully, the way you set down something fragile when your hands are not entirely trustworthy. She was aware of Chester moving, coming around the table, standing closer to her, not touching but present. She was aware of Eli and Colt having gone completely still. "What are you saying to me?" Winifred asked. Martha's eyes were bright with something that was trying very hard to be controlled. "I am saying that Rosalind Crane was my sister's daughter, my niece. She got into trouble at 19, and the man would not marry her, and her family was ashamed, and they sent her away to have the child, and they gave the child to a neighbor woman whose own baby had died. A woman named Margaret Hawkins in San Marcos." The ground had not stopped moving since Martha had first spoken. Winifred was gripping the edge of the table now. "My mother's name was Margaret Hawkins, in San Marcos." "Yes," Martha said, "I know. How long have you known who I am?" Martha closed her eyes briefly. "I suspected from the first day, the way you look. You are the image of Rosalind. I did not say anything because I did not know for certain and because she stopped." "Because why?" Winifred pressed. "Because I was afraid," Martha said, and the nakedness of those 4 words from this woman who was afraid of almost nothing cracked something in the room wide open. "Because if you were who I thought you were, it would mean you were my blood. And if you were my blood, then what was growing between you and Chester was—" "Stop." Chester's voice was sharp. He had moved to stand beside Winifred, and his hand had come to rest on the table between them, not touching her but close, a physical declaration of alignment. "Mama, stop right there." "Chester, I have to say it." "Then say it clearly and say it once," he said, and his voice was tight with control and something underneath the control that sounded like fear. Martha looked at him and then at Winifred. "If you are Rosalind's daughter, then you are my grandniece. And I am Chester's grandmother on my mother's side, which makes Chester your—" "That is enough," Chester said, and his voice was very quiet. "That is enough right now." Winifred was very still. She was running the family lines in her head with the deliberate precision of someone who is using mathematics to keep themselves from feeling until they can afford to feel. Martha was Chester's grandmother, which meant Martha's sister's granddaughter would be Chester's second cousin. Second cousins. She ran it again. Second cousins once removed, possibly, depending on the exact generations. She looked up. "Second cousins," she said. "That is what we are talking about." Martha blinked. "What?" "You are Chester's grandmother. Rosalind was your niece, which makes her your sister's daughter, which means she would be Chester's first cousin once removed, and her child would be Chester's second cousin. That is not—" Winifred paused, making sure of her logic. "That is a very distant connection. That is not what you were implying." Martha looked at her. Then she looked at Chester. Chester was looking at Winifred with an expression that was equal parts relief and something far more complicated. "I thought," Martha began. "You thought we were closer relations than we are," Winifred said. She was not angry. She was, if anything, beginning to feel something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight since this conversation began. "Martha, are you telling me you have been carrying this secret for 5 months because you were afraid I was too closely related to your grandson to—" She stopped herself before finishing that sentence in front of the boys. Martha's shoulders dropped. She looked, suddenly, 10 years older and 10 times more exhausted. "I did not know the lines well enough. I was not sure. I only knew you looked exactly like Rosalind and that I had given a child away to a woman named Hawkins and that you had shown up on this ranch and that Chester looked at you in a way he had not looked at anyone in a very long time, and I was afraid." Chester crossed the kitchen and crouched down in front of his grandmother's chair and took both her weathered hands in his. "Mama," he said quietly, "you should have told me. The moment you suspected, you should have told me." "I know," she said. Her voice had gone small. "I know it. I was afraid it would drive her away if it turned out to be nothing, and I was afraid of what it would mean if it turned out to be something. Either way, I could not find the courage to open my mouth." Chester held her hands for a long moment. Then he stood and turned to look at Winifred across the kitchen, and the expression on his face was something she had never quite seen on him before, open and unguarded and a little raw, all the careful distance gone. "I need to think," Winifred said. "Of course," he said immediately. She walked out of the kitchen, through the main room, and out the front door onto the porch, and she stood in the October evening air and looked out at the vast darkness of the land under a sky full of stars, and she put her hands on the porch railing and held on. She was not who she had thought she was. Or rather, she was everything she had always been, but there was more underneath it than she had known, a layer of origin she had never had access to. Margaret Hawkins had been a good mother, a loving mother, and had told Winifred she was her daughter in every way that mattered, which was true, but had never told her about the layer underneath, the woman who had been too young and too frightened and too pressured to keep her child. Rosalind Crane, who was apparently dead, Martha had said, died of fever in 1869, never knowing what had become of her daughter, who had looked out of a sepia photograph with eyes that were Winifred's own eyes. She heard the door open and she knew it was Chester without turning around. He came to stand beside her at the railing, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the October cool, and they stood in silence for a while, looking at the same darkness and the same stars. "Are you all right?" he asked finally. "I will be," she said. "I am just adjusting." "That is understandable," he said. Another silence. The stars were extraordinary, the way they always were out here on this flat land with no competing light, just the enormous sky doing what it had been doing since before any of them were born. "Chester," she said. "Yes. What your grandmother was afraid of. The reason she was carrying all of that." She paused. "She was right to take it seriously. Whatever we are or are not to each other, she was right that something was." She stopped. "Growing," he said, completing the word she had left hanging. His voice was low and careful and completely honest. "Yes, she was right about that." She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. "I need to know," she said, "what this changes for you, knowing that I might be connected to your family in that way." "You are a distant relation by blood," he said, "to a grandmother I love dearly. That is the fact of it. And you are the woman who has been in this household for 5 months and has put my boys back together and has made this house feel like a home again, and who I have been trying very hard not to think about as often as I think about you." He paused. "The second part matters more to me than the first." She turned back toward the darkness. Her heart was doing something quite extraordinary. "I have never been in one place long enough to know what this feels like," she said, meaning everything she had not been able to say directly. "I have never let myself. I have always been ready to leave." "Are you still ready to leave?" he asked. A long pause. "No," she said, "I am not." She heard him exhale slowly, the kind of exhale that carries something it has been holding for a long time. They stood on that porch together in the October night for a long while before either of them moved or spoke again. And when they finally went back inside, the kitchen had been restored to something like normalcy. Martha with red eyes but a straight spine. The boys pretending to play cards at the table with the transparent unsuccessfulness of people who had been listening to everything they could hear from inside and were now performing nonchalance. Winifred looked at this family, this specific configuration of people who had lost things and continued forward and made room for each other, and were now making room for her. And she felt something in her chest that was enormous and terrifying and exactly right. The autumn moved forward with the sense of something building. The matter of Winifred's origins became, in the quiet weeks that followed, something the family turned over and examined together rather than separately. Martha, released from the burden of her secret, talked about Rosalind with a tenderness that suggested she had been carrying the guilt of a lost child for decades. She told Winifred stories. Rosalind had loved horses and hated sewing, and had a laugh that could carry across a field. She had been clever and stubborn, and entirely too trusting of people who did not deserve it. "She sounds like someone I know," Colt said, and Winifred had laughed, and Martha had smiled at her with a look that held decades of accumulated love looking for a place to land. Chester wrote a letter to a judge he knew in Austin, outlining the family situation and requesting guidance on the matter of verifying the connection. Not because anyone doubted it, the photograph was evidence enough, but because Winifred had said quietly that she would like, if possible, to have something on paper, to have her origins documented somewhere, to have proof that she had belonged to someone, even before Margaret Hawkins. Chester had understood without her having to explain further. The judge's response came in late October and confirmed what they already knew. Rosalind Crane's daughter, given to Margaret and Henry Hawkins of San Marcos in the spring of 1852, had been born Winifred Crane and renamed Winifred Hawkins. The document still existed in the San Marcos County records, placed there by Margaret Hawkins herself, with a thoroughness and care that suggested the woman had wanted the truth to be findable, even if she never found the moment to speak it herself. Winifred had read that letter 3 times, and the third time she had been sitting at the kitchen table alone, and she had put her face in her hands and cried for the first time since she had arrived, not from sadness exactly, or not only from sadness, but from the particular release of finding out that she had always been real, that her origins had been witnessed and recorded and cared for even when she had not known it. Martha had found her there and had sat beside her and put a hand over hers without speaking, which was exactly the right thing to do, and Winifred had thought that whatever else was complicated about this woman, she was fundamentally good, and that counted for a great deal. Denton Pruitt's silence over the following weeks was either a product of the lawyer's letters or a product of whatever he thought he knew, having been neutralized by Winifred's own knowledge of herself. She did not hear from him again through October. She chose not to wait in fear and chose instead to trust that Chester had meant what he said, which was that this was a safe place. That trust was not easy for her. It was the most deliberate act of faith she had performed in years. She built it day by day like everything else that was real. The change between her and Chester came gradually, and then all at once, the way most things that are genuinely true come. It was a Sunday in November, one of those Texas autumn days where the air has a clarity that makes everything look edged and new. Chester had saddled 2 horses without being asked about it, and when Winifred came out onto the porch with her coffee, he had looked up from the corral and said, "Would you like to see the east pasture before winter closes it down?" She had looked at him over her cup in the morning light and said, "Yes." They rode out together through the tall grass, side by side, and he showed her the parts of the land he loved most, the spring-fed hollow at the base of the eastern hills, the rock formation that the local Tonkawa had marked with figures she could barely make out but that Chester had learned to read, the stand of old live oaks at the property line that had been standing since before any settler had put a fence in this country. He talked about the land with a reverence that she found unexpectedly moving. He was not a sentimental man in the conventional sense, not given to flowery expression, but his relationship with this place was a love affair as real as any she had ever witnessed. And listening to him speak about it, she understood something about the bones of who he was, the way the land was not just something he owned, but something he was in conversation with, something he felt responsible toward. "Do you see yourself here in 20 years?" she asked. It was a forward question, and she knew it. He looked at her across the easy distance between their horses. "I have been seeing myself here in 20 years for a long time," he said. "It has always been clear." Just he paused. "The rest of the picture has been less clear." She looked back at the horizon. The live oaks were dark against the pale sky. "I think I am beginning to see a picture," she said quietly. He did not respond immediately. When she turned to look at him, he was watching her with an expression that she had learned over 5 months to read, careful and deep and fully present. "Winifred," he said. "Chester," she said back, and the corner of her mouth lifted slightly. He laughed, which was one of those sounds she had been quietly cataloging since the barn with the injured calf. Because Chester Shepard laughing was something she could spend a significant amount of time being near. "I'm not good at this," he said. "Speaking about these things, I have had reason to believe I was particularly bad at it." "You are doing fine," she said. "I am trying to say something that I have been not saying for approximately 5 months," he said. "I know," she said. "I have been not saying it too." He looked at her. The autumn light was doing extraordinary things to this whole landscape. "I would like to say it now," he said. "Then say it," she said, and her heart was doing the extraordinary thing again. "I love you," Chester Shepard said. He said it plainly and directly and without theatrical preamble, the same way he did everything, with his full self and no performance. "I have loved you since somewhere around the middle of June, and I have been keeping it in a drawer because I could not figure out the right moment. But I have come to think there is no right moment. There is just the moment you are in." Winifred Hawkins had been alone for 4 years. She had been cautious for longer than that. She had built a life out of managing alone and trusting carefully, and never letting herself believe in permanence, because experience had taught her that permanence was something you could not count on. But she was on a horse in November sunlight on a piece of land that had started to feel like home, beside a man who had stood between her and threat without hesitation, who had held his family together through genuine heartbreak, who had listened to her tell the worst of her history without flinching, who laughed in barns over injured calves, who knew the names of everything that grew on his land, who had just said "I love you" the exact way she would have asked someone to say it if she had been brave enough to ask. "I love you too," she said. "I have for months. I have been extraordinarily disciplined about not showing it." He smiled. It was not the careful, polite smile she had seen in those first weeks, but the real one, the one that reached his eyes entirely and made him look younger and entirely different and exactly himself. "You were remarkably disciplined," he said. "It was very frustrating." She laughed. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat there on horseback holding hands in the November light for a long, wordless moment that said everything the previous 5 months had been building toward. December came in cold and bright and full. Chester asked her to marry him on a Tuesday evening in the kitchen, because that was where they had their most important conversations, and he did it with a simplicity and directness that was completely him. He did not have a ring yet, he told her, but he had spoken to a jeweler in San Marcos, and she would be able to choose what she liked. He told her he wanted her to stay, not as the hired help, not as a distant relative who had wandered into the family by accident of blood and fate. As his wife and partner, as the woman who ran this household because she loved it and the people in it, and because he intended to love her for the rest of whatever time he was given. She said yes immediately, with no hesitation at all, which was how she knew the thing was thoroughly and completely true. Martha cried at the dinner table when Chester announced it, and made no attempt to conceal this, which was so unlike her that Eli and Colt both stared at their grandmother with equal parts alarm and awe. Then Colt let out a yell that was, as he later explained, purely involuntary. Eli stood up and crossed to Winifred and hugged her, which was the first time he had initiated any physical affection with her, and Winifred hugged him back and felt the shaking in his shoulders that meant he was crying too, and she held on until it settled. "You are not going anywhere," she said quietly just for him. "I know," he said. "That is what I am crying about." She understood him precisely. The wedding was held in February of 1879, when the weather broke briefly into warmth and the ranch was showing the first tentative green of approaching spring. It was a simple ceremony, performed by the circuit preacher, who came through Mesa Hollow twice a year, on the front porch of the ranch house with the open land as backdrop, and a gathering of neighbors and hands and the few residents of the nearest town who had come to know Winifred over the months she had been in residence. She wore a dress of deep blue that she had sewn herself over the winter months, knowing exactly what she wanted, taking the time to do it right. Martha had added a small piece of lace at the collar that had belonged to Chester's mother, offered without ceremony but with a significance they both understood. Winifred had simply held it for a moment, and then let Martha pin it and thanked her quietly and meant every syllable. Chester, standing on that porch in his best coat with his hair actually cut for the occasion, watched her come through the front door and across the porch toward him, and the expression on his face was something she intended to remember for the rest of her life. It was not performed emotion. It was the look of a man who has arrived somewhere he has been traveling toward without knowing it. The preacher read the words and they made their promises to each other in voices that were steady and clear. And when Chester took both her hands in his and looked at her directly, she thought of a woman named Rosalind Crane who had loved horses and had a carrying laugh, and had made a desperate choice very long ago that had sent Winifred on a journey she could not have designed. She thought of Margaret Hawkins, who had raised her with love and thoroughness, and it turned out, careful documentation. She thought of the Borden Creek Road and the cracked satchel and the $23 and the advertisement folded in her boot, and she thought how strange and specific and altogether unlikely the path had been. And then she thought about nothing but the man in front of her and the promises they were making, because those were what mattered now, not the path behind but the country ahead. After the ceremony there was food and music, a fiddle and a guitar played by two of the ranch hands, and dancing on the packed earth of the yard as the February sun set orange and violet over the distant hills. Chester was not, as he cheerfully admitted, a natural dancer, but he tried with genuine good humor and held her well, and by the third song they were moving together with the ease of two people who have learned each other's rhythms, and she had her head against his shoulder and his arms were around her, and the music was carrying them in slow circles, and she thought, with the full capacity of a person who has lived through the absence of it, this is what safe feels like. This is what home is. Eli danced with Martha, which made the old woman smile in a way that transformed her face entirely. Colt, having initially declared dancing to be beneath his dignity, lasted approximately 10 minutes before he was swept up by the enthusiasm of the occasion and was dancing with almost everyone available, including the preacher's wife, who was delighted. Spring arrived on the ranch with the momentum of things that have been quietly building for months. The cattle drove went better than the previous 2 years combined. Chester hired 2 additional ranch hands, good men, brothers from San Antonio who came with solid references and turned out to be skilled and dependable. The east fence that had been a persistent problem for 3 years was rebuilt properly. The spring-fed hollow that Chester had shown Winifred in November became a place they visited regularly in the early mornings, sitting on the rock shelf above it with their coffee, talking about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. She learned the ranch with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, not because Chester expected her to, but because she was genuinely interested, and because the land was now hers in the way that things become yours when you love them. She learned to read weather from the way the cattle moved. She learned which horses would test a new rider and which were genuinely generous. She understood the accounts better than anyone except Chester himself within 3 months, and when he handed her the ledger and told her he trusted her with it completely, she had felt the weight of that trust and taken it seriously. The news that she was expecting came in May, and Chester had received it in his characteristically understated way, which is to say he had gone very still for a moment, and then his face had broken open into that real smile, and he had crossed the kitchen and gathered her against him with a gentleness that was also fierce, the way he was with things he loved entirely. Martha, when told, sat down abruptly in her kitchen chair and pressed her hand to her mouth and said, with no ambiguity whatsoever, "Thank God." Eli, now 17 and approaching the conversation with the considered gravity he brought to important matters, shook Chester's hand and then turned to Winifred and said, "This baby has good people to grow up around." It was such an unexpectedly mature and sweet observation that she had hugged him again, and this time she was the one whose shoulders shook slightly, and he patted her back with the calm patience of a boy who had become a young man somewhere in the past year. Colt's response was immediate and unfiltered. He wanted to know if he could teach the baby to ride before it could walk, which was not physiologically possible, Winifred informed him, but she appreciated the enthusiasm. The summer of 1879 moved through the ranch in long golden days and warm evenings on the porch. Winifred's pregnancy was straightforward, managed by the doctor who came out from San Marcos twice, and a midwife named Abilene who lived 12 miles out and was practical and competent, and told Winifred she was healthy as a draft horse, which was not the most romantic description but was entirely reassuring. Chester was attentive without being hovering, which was exactly the right calibration. He checked in, he helped where help was wanted, he made sure she was not overtaxing herself, and he did all of this with the quiet matter-of-factness that characterized his best impulses. At night, lying in the bed they now shared in the main bedroom of the house they now shared in every sense, he would sometimes talk about the baby with a wondering openness that she found more intimate than almost anything else, because it was Chester allowing himself to hope forward, which was not something he did easily or often. He told her one August night with the window open and the summer air moving through, to be a different kind of father than the one he had been given. Not because his father had been cruel, the man had not been cruel, but because he had been absent in the ways that mattered, always working, always managing, always pointing toward the next season. Chester wanted to be present, to know his child, to be someone they could come to. "You already are that," Winifred said, thinking of Eli and Colt and the particular quality of safety those boys had in this man's keeping. "You have been that for 2 years. That is different," he said. "That was stepping in when stepping in was required." "It is less different than you think," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You are very good at telling me things I need to hear." "It is a skill I have been developing," she said. He laughed softly in the dark and reached for her hand, and she took it. The matter of Denton Prout resolved itself in September in a way that Winifred had not expected but found deeply appropriate. A letter arrived from Borden Creek, not from Prout himself, but from the lawyer Chester had employed, informing them that Denton Prout had been indicted on charges of land fraud by the district court in Austin, charges brought by 3 separate ranchers who had collectively had enough and had the documentation to prove their case. His assets had been seized pending trial. His connections to the local sheriff had been severed when that same sheriff, faced with federal scrutiny, had very quickly determined that his association with Prout was not worth protecting. Winifred had read the letter on the porch in the September morning and had felt the last piece of vigilance she had been carrying, the watchfulness she had maintained even in safety, simply put itself down and rest. Chester came and stood beside her and read over her shoulder, and when he finished reading he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "How are you?" "Free," she said simply. He put his arm around her from behind, careful of the considerable change in her shape at 7 months along, and rested his chin against her temple, and she leaned into him, and they stood like that in the September morning for a long time. The baby came on the 4th of November, 1879, in the early morning hours when the night was still dark and the house was quiet. It was a boy, solid and loud and immediately opinionated, with dark hair and his father's jaw and a pair of lungs that announced his arrival to the entire property. Abilene, the midwife, pronounced him perfect with the certainty of someone who had seen many babies and knew what perfect looked like. Chester held his son for the first time with the concentrated attention he brought to everything that mattered, his arms absolutely steady, his face doing something it had never done before, or at least had never done in front of Winifred. He was entirely undone in the best possible way. He looked at this small new person with an expression that was wonder and ferocity and love and terror all at once, and Winifred, watching from the bed, thought she had never loved him more than in that exact moment. They named him James William Shepard. James for Chester's brother, the uncle the boys had loved. William for no one specific, simply because it suited him, because Winifred said William was a name that grew well on a person. Colt, presented with his new cousin the morning after the birth, held him with extreme concentration and announced that he was, in fact, going to teach him to ride before he could walk, and this time Winifred did not correct him. Eli sat beside Winifred on the bed and held young James with the steady competence of someone who had once been very small himself and had been held carefully and knew how important it was, and he looked at the baby for a long, quiet moment and then looked at Winifred and said, "Thank you for staying." She had to swallow hard before she could speak. "Thank you for letting me," she said. Martha held her grandson's son and did not say anything at all for a full 5 minutes, which was the longest she had gone without speaking in the entire time Winifred had known her. When she finally looked up, she looked at Winifred over the baby's head, and there was everything in her face, the years and the secrets and the guilt and the love and the relief and the gratitude and the particular joy of a person who has lived long enough to see things come right. "Your mother," Martha said, meaning Rosalind, "would have loved to see this day." "I know," Winifred said. "I think she sees it anyway." Martha nodded once firmly, as if this were a practical fact she was confirming. The winter was mild that year, and the ranch was full in a way it had not been in a long time. Not just with people, but with the sound of them, the particular living noise of a household that has found its proper size. Young James, who had come into the world with opinions and had maintained this approach consistently, was an extremely vocal participant in all domestic life from the beginning. Eli had taken on increasing responsibility with the cattle operation and was beginning to talk about attending an agricultural college in Austin the following year, a conversation that Chester supported with everything he had, telling his nephew that education was not something to be skipped, that the ranch would be here when he came back. Colt, 15 now, was growing into the particular kind of young man who is interested in everything and good at most of it, and who had recently displayed a significant aptitude for horse training that had Chester making quiet plans for extending the ranch's operation in that direction. Martha, who had seemed ageless for most of the time Winifred had known her, was beginning to show her years in small ways, moving more slowly in the mornings, tiring earlier in the evenings. Winifred managed the household in a way that absorbed most of the physical work without ever framing it as diminishment, because Martha's mind was as formidable as ever and her opinions were essential, and the balance between them had long since settled into something that was genuine partnership. On a spring evening in 1880, when James was almost 6 months old and the ranch was green with new growth, and the horses in the corral were performing the particular show-off behavior of horses in spring weather, Chester found Winifred on the front porch watching the sunset with the baby on her lap. He sat down beside her in the second porch chair, the one that had become his chair in the way that spaces become yours over time, and they watched the sun take the sky through amber and rose and deep violet while James made the small, interested sounds of a person encountering the world for the first time and finding it mostly satisfactory. "I have been thinking," Chester said. "About what?" she asked. "About the east pasture," he said. "I want to put in a proper orchard, apples and peaches. It will take a few years to establish, but once it does, I think that is a wonderful idea," she said. He looked at her. "I was also thinking about us." "About us," she repeated, with a slight lift that was not quite a question. "About the fact that you have been the best thing that has ever happened to this ranch and this family," he said, "and that I am not sure I say that plainly enough." She turned to look at him. "Chester, you say it every day." "Not in so many words," he said. "In all the words," she said, meaning the morning coffee already made, meaning the lawyer's letters and the firm declarations on the porch, meaning the steady arm around her in the September morning, meaning the way he looked at her when she came into a room, which was the same look he had given her on the porch on their wedding day and had never once stopped giving her. He took her free hand. She turned her palm up to hold his. "I am thinking," he said, "that we should have another." She looked at him. The sunset was extraordinary behind him, all that rose and violet. "Eventually," she said. "Eventually," he agreed. "There is no rush." "We have time," she said. "We have all the time we need," he said. Young James, at this point, made a decisive sound that suggested he had thoughts about the future as well, and they both looked down at him and then at each other. And they laughed together in the spring evening with the ranch spread out before them, and the sky going dark above them, and the full, real, complicated, astonishing life they had built around them on all sides. 2 years after that conversation, in the spring of 1882, Winifred and Chester's second child arrived. Another boy, whom they named Thomas Chester Shepard, and who came into the world with the same lung capacity as his brother but a noticeably more philosophical temperament, lying quietly for long periods looking at things with an attention that made Colt, now 17, say he looked like he was solving a problem. By then Eli had come back from his year at Agricultural College in Austin, full of ideas and enthusiasm, and had formally become Chester's partner in the ranch operation, with his name on the deed alongside his uncle's, a thing that Chester had arranged without fanfare on Eli's 20th birthday, and that had reduced the young man to a silence so profound and complete that it was 5 full minutes before he could speak. The orchard had been planted in the east pasture, and while the trees were still young and not yet producing, they had taken well to the land and stood in their rows with the particular promising look of things that have decided to stay. Martha was still present, slower now but still formidably minded, presiding over the household with the authority of her years and the warmth that Winifred had worked to reach and had finally, thoroughly reached, and which turned out to be the warmest thing on the property, which was saying something given the Texas summers. On a Wednesday evening in June of 1882, when the house was full of the sound of 2 boys and 2 young men and 1 formidable grandmother, and the ordinary music of supper being prepared, and the day's work being put to rest, Winifred stood at the kitchen window in the last light of a long day and looked out at the herb garden that Martha kept, and beyond it at the corrals, and beyond them at the rolling green of the west pasture. And she thought about a woman alone on a road with $23 and a cracked satchel, taking the only door that appeared to be open. She had walked through it looking for work. What she had found was this, all of this. The family that had been waiting, that had not known it was waiting, that had needed her as much as she had needed them, in the specific and irreplaceable way that people need each other when they are each carrying something that is exactly the right shape for what the other one has been missing. Chester came through the kitchen behind her, pausing to drop a kiss onto the top of her head in the easy way of a man who has been doing this for years and has never once taken it for granted. "Supper almost ready?" he asked. 10 minutes, she said. "Good," he said. "I am going to drag Colt away from the barn before he decides the horses need another hour of company." "They probably do," she said. "They probably do," he agreed, and went out the back door into the evening, and she heard him calling Colt's name across the yard, and Colt's answer, and the sounds of the ranch settling into evening around all of them. Thomas was beginning to make noise from his crib in the next room, which meant he had woken from his nap and had reached the limit of his patience with being alone. Winifred dried her hands and went to him, and lifted him up, and carried him back to the kitchen where the stove was warm and the window was golden with the last of the day. And she sat with him at the kitchen table and showed him the light moving on the wall, and he watched it with his philosophical attention, and she watched him, and thought about how strange and specific the paths that lead us to the places we are meant to be. She had come here looking for work. She had found something that did not have a simple name, something that was made of belonging and purpose and love in its fullest sense, the kind that is not just romantic feeling but the daily, chosen, continual act of being someone's person and letting them be yours. She had found Chester, who was steady and honest, and who loved her in the way that was neither dramatic nor careless, but was thorough and present and entirely real. She had found Eli and Colt, who had given her the chance to love two young people who needed it, and had taken that chance without reservation, and who had, in doing so, given her something she had not known she was missing. She had found Martha, who was impossible and loving, and had been carrying a secret shaped exactly like Winifred Hawkins for years before Winifred Hawkins walked up the drive. She had found her own story, the true version, the one with all the layers visible, the one where Rosalind Crane's daughter grew up to be Margaret Hawkins' daughter, and then found her way to the place where both of those threads converged and made sense. She had found the ranch and the land, and the orchard that would give fruit in a few years, and the horses in the corral, and the big sky that was never the same sky twice. She had found, sitting at the table in a June evening in 1882 with her baby in her arms and her husband's voice carrying in from the yard, and the sound of her family moving through the house around her, exactly the thing that people spend their whole lives looking for. She had found home. Chester came back in from the yard with Colt behind him, both of them carrying the smell of horses and evening air, and Eli came down from the room above with a book under his arm, and Martha appeared from the back of the house where she had been resting, moving more slowly but with that same straight spine, and they all converged in the kitchen the way they did every evening, finding their chairs and their places, the particular arrangement of this family that had been assembled by grief and chance and choice and love. Winifred put Thomas in his high chair and stood to finish the supper, and Chester stood beside her at the stove to help because he had taken to doing this, had decided somewhere along the way that the division of labor in a household was something two people negotiated and not something written in advance, which was one of the 10,000 small things she loved about him. They moved around each other in that kitchen the way they always did, easy and familiar and aware, and above the stove and the voices and the good smell of supper, and the sound of Thomas banging contentedly on his tray and Colt telling Eli something about a horse with great enthusiasm, and Martha asking someone to pass her coffee, above all of it, Winifred caught Chester's eye across the kitchen, and he looked at her the way he always looked at her. She smiled at him. He smiled back. And the evening opened around them, full and warm and entirely theirs.